In this video, I will be giving you a brief introduction into Stuart Hall's reception theory. Now, if you're in the UK and you did media studies at school, then you probably know a lot more about this than I do, but I just think it's a really interesting one, and being aware of it can really change the way that you consume media. Now, before I go into reception theory, I just want to briefly touch on Stuart Hall's representation theory, because I think there are some nice overlaps there that can be discussed. So Stuart Hall defined representation in two ways. Firstly, it's the idea that something has been represented. In his lecture at the Open University in 1997, he looks at the word representation or representation as carrying with it the notion that something was there already and through the media has been represented. The second definition of representation are people who stand in for us. They are our representatives. Now he gives the example of politicians, so where we can't be, they can be, and in theory they represent us. That's their job, in theory. Both of these ideas come together when we think of representation as the way in which meaning is somehow given to things which are depicted. So if it's a news article, the words and images used represent an event that has occurred. They give meaning to it. And the fact that we all have different concerns, interests, and life experiences, we don't all agree with the imposed meaning. So that means events don't have one true fixed meaning, or an objective one. Think of a major world event that gets reported by every outlet. Each representation of the event will convey its own meaning, and I think that is something that most people are generally kind of intuitively aware of. But I'll go into that a little bit more when we talk about reception theory. Hall claims that there is no meaning of an event until it has been represented, and that representation isn't something that happens after the event, but it's part of the event itself. So in essence, the event didn't meaningfully exist until it has been represented. So the way something is put to us as an audience, the way it has been represented, plays a role in determining the meaning. So we're talking about dissecting things down to their elements, what we can see, what we can hear, what's been excluded even. All of these decisions made by the producer will help shape the meaning of the text. And remember, this goes for all types of media. So the example I'm going to use is of Peaky Blinders. Now, the show follows an infamous gang in Birmingham just after World War I. The head of the family, Tommy Shelby, is known in Birmingham as the man that pretty much everyone is afraid of, apart from maybe his brother Arthur. But the point is, you do not cross Tommy Shelby. Now, I'm not giving away any spoilers here or anything, but the Shelby family are responsible for a lot, and I mean a lot, of bad things throughout the series. And yet, as the viewer, we have nothing but love for them. This is because of the way that they are represented. If we look at what has been included in the series, we see a lot of close-knit family moments and a detailed backstory that helps you identify with them and even empathize with them. We see far less of this when it comes to other characters. So when the Shelbys are doing what they do, the audience sees their actions as honourable and just, whereas when they are on the receiving end of violence, we empathize with them. This is obviously a very basic example of representation, but I'm just making the point that in all forms of media, we are bombarded with very particular and deliberate narrative arcs that are designed to shape our opinions of an event. So now I'm going to talk about Hall's reception theory. Hall claims that producers, which is anyone who is responsible for the media that you consume, encode messages into that media in the way I've just been describing. Messages are formed to project the ideologies of those at the top. Now, most CEO decision makers, be it in the news, advertising companies, or just generally throughout the media, are white, middle-class men, usually of a certain age. Now, these ideologies that they project often include negative stereotypes and outdated values, and the intention, in my opinion, is to either invoke fear or to reinforce and validate some opinions that people might have. And this is where representation comes in. The information you receive comes to you through the lens of whoever's in charge. He calls these people the production elite in broadcasting. They have their own values, their own ideologies, which are often reflected in how their companies operate. And through representation, they reach you. Let's take something basic like news reporters. Now, for this example, I'm not talking about the stories they report on, I'm just talking about the news reporters themselves. The dominant accent you're going to hear is often some form of received pronunciation. Now, there's a much wider variety of regional accents today than there once were, but they're still often quite diluted. They're often accents that convey authority and a certain socio-economic background. Now, here we can see the production itself mirroring the values of the production elites, because this is where they come from. These are the values that they hold. Paul claims that an event must become a story before it can become a communicative event. This is the idea that everything we hear on the news is developed into some kind of narrative. We never hear, this happened, these are all the facts, and we move on. This image was taken from Stuart Hall's essay, Encoding, Decoding, and if we start off on the left-hand side at the bottom, we can see the frameworks of knowledge, relations of production, and technical infrastructure. So these are the things that the producers have to work with, and with that they can encode their messages into their stories. At the top we have the actual broadcast itself, the discourse, which is then decoded in accordance with our own frameworks of knowledge, relations of production, and technical infrastructure as consumers. So the way we decode these messages depends entirely on our own values and ideologies. It's not like we're all just hypnotized zombies kind of glazing over while the TV implants ideas into our heads. If we take this example here of a young footballer buying a house and just analyse the language that's used, remember the event is that he's bought a house. That's it, that's all that's happened. We see the words splashes out, mansion, never started a Premier League match, threatened to leave. It breaks down exactly what features the house includes with the word boasts. These are all loaded terms. Now, according to Stuart Hall, all of these words would have been chosen deliberately with the aim of encoding the message that young black men are irresponsible, flashy, reckless, and even undeserving of the money that they have. This is actually a very good example of the media shaping stories to promote certain ideologies, because just a few months later, the same event happened to a young white footballer. He's playing for the exact same club and he bought a house, the same thing. Now, if you're in the UK, you will know this already, but this is how the same media outlet reported the same event. We see the words starlet, home, for his mum, set up a future, close-knit family. Now, straight away, we can see that there is a very different tone used. The language used is much more positive, and the audience is encouraged to see this player as a good influence for younger generations. Firstly, he's described as a starlet, which, to be fair, a few years on from when this article was written, Phil Foden is proven to be just that. But the subconscious reading is that he deserves to spend his money on a house in a way that Adara Bioyo just didn't. The fact that he's described as having a close-knit family, and that this is for his mum, and that he's set up a future, all of these words are used to encourage the audience to feel a certain way. Other examples also from the football world are the countless cases of supposed mistaken identity. All of these examples in the last few years that have made it to print in the British media again send the message that it doesn't really matter, and they're all the same. So the view that people hold with regards to race, gender and sexuality often stem from the media and their chosen representation. Generation after generation being fed with the same ideologies will inevitably have an impact on the way the public feel about certain issues. This leads to more alienation for these groups in society, and people often feel vindicated in their opinions, which, as we know, leads to more conflict and more violence. So, once the message has been encoded and delivered, the audience then decodes it, and they can fall into one of three different camps. Firstly, there's the dominant or preferred reading. This is when the audience receives the meaning that was intended by the broadcaster and either consciously or subconsciously agrees with it. According to Hall's theory, the producer's aim is to create a story that best serves the needs of their dominant audience. In our example, someone who takes a dominant reading would agree that most young black men are reckless and irresponsible. It plays into pre-existing prejudice and biases. Then there's the oppositional reading. This is when the audience completely rejects the meaning that the broadcaster was intending to put across. This can be through general cynicism and suspicion, or just a poorly delivered message. In this example, an oppositional reader would see this headline as ridiculous. Of course, someone's skin colour doesn't determine the way they feel about someone spending their own money. And then there's the negotiated reading, the kind of middle ground. This is when the audience may agree with certain elements of the message, but understands that the oppositional reading also has some valid points. So someone might agree that footballers in general are paid way too much money, but at least he's investing it wisely. Buying a home is of course supposed to be one of the best investments you can make, after all. There's something about this, for me at least, that does feel quite intuitive. The idea that the same event is reported on in completely different ways, usually to reflect the ideologies of the production elite, as well as their own particular audience, seems irrefutable, to be honest. Stuart Hall wrote his essay Encoding Decoding in the 1980s, so the landscape of the media was a long way from where it is today. Obviously, television still has a massive influence, but most of the media we consume comes through the internet. I still think it's worth bearing these theories in mind though, because you might look at it and go, well, we're not dictated to by the production elites anymore. We've got these platforms like Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, even YouTube, where you can make your own media and make your own stories. But can you really? I mean, there's the obvious issue of censorship, which ties directly into representation theory. For example, I'm bound by YouTube's rules, and in this case they are the dominant hegemony, to use Hall's terms, and their own values and ideologies will be promoted, and opposing ones won't be tolerated. But I feel that is just a discussion for another day, because that is a deep talking point. The point I really want to make about the modern day media is that production elites have been encoding their messages and, in a sense, shaping reality for generations now. We've all grown up in a world where all our experiences are representations of reality. So with that in mind, anyone you choose to engage with, to a certain extent, is coming from an institutionalized mindset. If we take this view then, the system is almost a self-sufficient one. We've gone from a top-down model where elites promote certain ideologies to society into a model where society promotes those ideologies to itself. Now, as much as ever then, I think it's important to process information through the lens of who is responsible for creating what I'm consuming. What are their ideologies? Can I see those ideologies playing out in what they are producing? And from there, you can then make your own decisions as to what media you choose to consume. Anyway, that did take a slight detour towards the end, but the key things to remember from Stuart Hall's theories are that the media has a hierarchical structure, with certain bosses being responsible for promoting their own values and ideologies. This is the core of representation theory. By turning facts into stories and encoding messages into their products, they present us with their ideologies. We decode those messages and understand the event to have a particular meaning depending on those messages. So that's Stuart Hall's representation theory and reception theory, just in a nutshell. As I always say, please go and dive deeper, do your own research, find out as much as you can about it, and try and apply it. The next headline you see, ask yourself those questions. Who made this? What's their ideology? What biases do they have? And if you can pick up the facts of the story, try using those to write up your own story that isn't so heavily loaded. Anyway, I'm going to wrap this up now. I've had a lot of fun making this video, so please make sure you give it a like, subscribe to the channel, check out my other videos, and I'll see you on the next one.